Hello and welcome to week 8 in Introduction to Sociology, and we have a bit of content to cover here. We have two chapters, chapters 13 and 14. I kind of debated now that I'm doing these new slideshows as to whether I was going to keep them separate or not, but all one big slideshow, and I'm going to talk really fast as I make my way through here, so you can rewind, and I'll try not to get too wordy on this. I say this, and if this ends up being over an hour long, just take me right off your Christmas card list. So let's take a look at chapter 13. We're going to look at aging and the elderly. And again, looking at that sociological perspective, primarily thinking about inequality and the way we define aging and the way we define elderly and that as it occurs within our society. So the first kind of thing that we want to look at is this notion of generations, and we've probably heard of these things before. Generation X, millennials, the baby boomers, what is that all about? And basically what these represent is the what we call in developmental psych the historical clock. When you were born and what society was like at that time as you aged through different milestones. What was your childhood like at that time? What was your adolescence like, your adulthood, getting jobs? What was going on in terms of world conflict and politics and science and technology? Define the characteristics, the general characteristics of that generation. It's not a prison cell. We can learn and grow and be beyond that. We don't, and maybe you'll look at the description for when you were born and say, I'm not like that at all. But there's some general trends that we recognize. And these are trends that are seen internationally. They might use different names, but the events that mark these different ages and generations in the United States are culturally embedded. They're not universal across the world. But in different parts of the world, they use similar terms to say, different generations of individuals that grew up in that particular country. So in ours, we have the silent generation. We have the greatest generation prior to that, actually. I probably should have included that. But the silent generation, this is the age leading up to and encompassing World War II. After World War II, we had the baby boomer generation. This is from 1946 to 1964. These are GIs coming back from wartime, and there was lots of kids born. Lots of kids born during that time. And we hear about the baby boomer generation. The top end of that generation right now is in retirement age, and so there's going to be a lot of retirees coming up. We have Generation X. I was born in 1965, so I have a little bit of baby boomer and a little bit in me, and I have a little bit of Gen X, probably a lot more Gen X, all the way up to people born in 1980. We have the millennials from 1980 to 1995. Generation Z, individuals from 1995 to 2010. And Generation Alpha, kids born after 2011. So you identify yourself within each one of these and then look it up. And there's tons of resource on the web about describing these different populations, and just kind of take a gander at it and say, we're going to have some discussions around it about, does this fit me? What is it about this that's like me? What is it not like? Does it successfully describe me or not? Now, another thing that we look at in terms of aging and generations and whatnot, this topic that we're looking at is demographics. And so let's get some of the facts. So here's Agent Friday. For many of you remember Dragnet. This precedes my time, but it was on television when I was a kid. He'd always say just the facts, man. So let's take a look at some of these facts. 6 demographic trends shaping the U.S. and the world in 2019. As this new census comes out, we'll get some additional information, but I'm going to take us over to a website here. Here's Fact Tank from the Pew Research Center 6 demographic trends shaping the U.S. and the world in 2019. Let's take a look at these. First one, millennials are the largest adult generation in the United States, but they are starting to share the spotlight with Generation Z. So an interesting trend going on there. Hispanics are projected to be the largest racial or ethnic minority group in the U.S. electorate when voters cast their ballots next year. Now, this is, of course, we understand that in the election, the Hispanic population was huge. Their turnout was huge in the most recent election. So we're actually seeing this sort of come true today. The American family continues to change, and look at this. Look at all the single moms in 1968. And then it's going down, then there's single dads, kind of remaining the same the whole time. But then there's cohabitating dads, cohabitating moms. These are the unmarried who are raising kids, either their own kids or stepkids. So that's the growing number of people. 17 and 18% are cohabitating dads and cohabitating moms who are either unmarried raising their own kids or there's stepchildren involved. So that's an interesting trend there. The immigration share of the U.S. population is approaching a record high, but remains below many of those of other countries. And that certainly has been reflected in the administration policies that this particular study encompasses. And the U.S. unauthorized immigrant population is at its lowest level in more than a decade. So not as many undocumented people. And then finally, we see incomes are rising in the U.S., but the increase is not being felt equally by all Americans. And you see this graph over here that Asians, for example, in the top 10% of the income distribution earn 10.7 times as much as Asians in the bottom 10%. So you see that difference between those at the changes in income move from here. Here's 1970 to 2016. You know, the changes in that top 10%. So some really interesting things going on in some interesting trends in terms of demographics and whatnot. Let's get back to the slideshow here. We also have instance of what we would call the graying of our population, the aging of our population. And this occurs not only because people are living longer, but because there's of mobility. So a state like Maine, for example, is growing at a particularly fast rate because the elderly population remains and some of the young people that are raised in Maine leave. So the percentage of the population that's older tends to be bigger in a state like Maine. So some of the trends that we see. So that what we're really looking at when we look at this in terms of where social policy is doing, we're looking in terms of what we'll look at inequality and abuse and neglect and all these things that can happen with the elderly. Then when you have the graying of a state or a graying of a nation, it forces the political bodies to respond to those things because those people are not only getting gray, they're the baby boomers. So they are individuals who are voting. So it's a very, very powerful voting base. And so that's why you see it's kind of difficult for anybody to even contemplate changes to something like Social Security, for example, because that would not go over well with the graying population who put them in office. And so these kinds of demographic changes are very important in terms of the political climates of what's going on. Now, in terms of culture and aging and how we approach aging in different ages and whatnot, we have this idea, again, from developmental psych. From developmental psych, we have the historical clock. We also have the social clock. Now, the social clock from a developmental psych point of view is what should you be doing at a particular age. If you think about a person's age, 14, 25, 82, and we have an internal representation of, well, what is a typical person at that age supposed to be doing right around now? And so these are the norms, values, and expectations associated with those particular things. And so so when we think about a person who's 65, well, are they approaching retirement? They're at the end of their career. They're looking, maybe moving someplace that's warmer, kind of, we have these images, but yet that doesn't necessarily match reality. It might not even match the majority. There's a common perception that people, when they age, end up in nursing homes, and yet that's a very small percentage of the elderly population actually ends up in a nursing home with that needing that kind of level of care. So it's interesting how we have these assumptions about what's going on in a person's life when they may not be real. Now, the next thing I want to look at is the generation gap. When we look at culture and aging, we think about what is this concept of the generation gap, and what it has to do with is technology. So we have an older technology, such as this typewriter, versus new technology like this computer. And what that produces is you have two generations, and it produces a gap. Between the gap is the knowledge that one generation has over the other because they're already understand the new technology. Just moments ago, before I started recording this, I was on a conference call with somebody helping them complete an application online to a new job, and they had to download the file, open it up in Acrobat Reader in order to be able to fill out the, wow, did we experience a person who was not computer literate? I mean, she's the same age as me, but does not have that experience of working with technology. And clearly, if there's, when you think about a younger person helping that individual to go there, it was actually really startling to see how little this person knew about computers, even though they were applying for a job that's going to be online. So good luck with that. And so so the generation gap is actually defined by technology. And interesting, sometimes there's always a gap from generation to generation, but I remember one time, a long time ago, I was listening to a National Public Radio broadcast, and they were talking about a study that came out that the generation gap between children and their grandparents was actually smaller than the generation gap between children and their parents, or the grandparents' kids. And the reason why that was because grandparents had been having more leisure time in the country. This was done in Australia. The study was that the elderly people in the study had more leisure time to engage in social media, to do those kinds of things, and to embrace those technologies. The sandwich generation that we're talking about, meaning that, the one bread is the parents and is the grandparents, then you have the kids, then you have the ones in the middle. Those were too busy running around, taking care of the parents and taking care of the kids at the same time, that the actual generation gap between the grandparents and the kids was smaller. They understood each other's technology better than the parents did. So it's not necessarily this sort of years and linear sort of relationship. It really has to do with the understanding of technology. And finally, we have some issues that, of course, come up. Culture and aging, ageism. This is a form of discrimination, any sort of discrimination we might have based on somebody's age, whether young or old. Poverty, once somebody's income goes away, unless they've prepared, and not many people have, compared to those who have, we have poverty, and that's, of course, a very dramatic issue. And, of course, we have issues of abuse and neglect and whatnot, of this disempowered population of individuals. And power being the thing. When somebody's not able to move as readily, or they don't have as much income, or that all of those factors serve to disempower that individual and create inequality. Now let's look at the assignments for this particular chapter. And we have a couple discussions. We have Chapter 13 discussion, where you can reflect upon the generation that you belong to. And the Chapter 13 assignment, just one discussion, but Chapter 13 assignment is actually an activity where you're going to engage in some financial planning for your own retirement. So there's a website I bring you to. as I'm getting my next slideshow ready here, there's a website that I'm going to bring you to, and that website will walk you through the steps of estimating how much money do you need to put aside in order to be able to pay all of your expenses that you predict will happen when you retire. And you can play around with this all you want. All you want. You can just go at it. The only thing I'm asking you to do is to join in a discussion. It's actually called an assignment, but it's in the form of a discussion, and talk about your experience. You don't have to reveal your plans. You don't have to reveal your income. Just talk about the experience of looking forward like that. It also is, it's a financial planning advising tool, so that if you develop a plan in there, I'd really encourage you to actually take a look at doing that and get an investment plan going. Start planning for your retirement. The earlier you can start this, the better. Okay, we switch gears over to marriage and family. So as we skip along into this content here, we know that the family is changing. I'm going to eventually change this graphic. I think that there's no people of color in this. And that is actually an aspect of our changing culture. Changing families is a much more mixed type relationships and families. And truth be told, it's kind of an old graphic, but the truth be told, even families of people you're not even related to by blood, but they're your family nonetheless. So to understand families, let's take a look at groups themselves and what we've learned about groups so far. Now, groups being individuals that interact frequently, share identity, and are interdependent with each other. That's what we call groups, okay? There's a culture that they share, so there's norms, values, and expectations associated with that group that's unique to that group, but also shares, of course, in larger society. There's a social structure where people have different statuses, job titles, different roles, job descriptions within that family and within society, how that group interacts with other groups. And then, of course, aspects of social control, including those recommended by society. And it's actually the function of the group. It's a function of the group to bring people into the fold. Now, all of these things that we know about groups can also be said about family. Family has culture, has social structure, and has social control. So everything that we've learned about groups so far, just lump it into your internalization schema of family. Pretty much all of those things are the same. So let's take a look at the four main perspectives here and relate them to family. So our first one is function. What is the function of the family? And it is, first, stabilization of society. And this is why you might hear some political rhetoric about the importance of the family. The family is a stabilizing social structure in society. We have status and roles that many of them actually arise from our family. They provide educational supports, economic supports, and their primary role is this sociological concept of socialization, which means to pass on what you need to know from generation to generation in order to survive in our society. Now, the conflict perspective, let's look at a dialogue that might occur and issues that come up in terms of the family and differences of opinion that might happen is, well, what if the family's not teaching quote unquote good values? Whose responsibility is it? Is it the school? Is it the community? Is it the church? If the family's not, teaching their kids the right things to do. What about public schools versus homeschooling? What if you don't like the values and expectations of the public school and you'd rather teach kids yourself, but yet there's things about the public school that prepare them for other environments outside of your family. So that kind of conflictual relationship. Where do we get this idea of women's work and men's work other than it originates in the family? What if families are failing? They're failing. And what does it mean to be a dysfunctional family other than being unable to fulfill those functions that we just went through? Socialization isn't happening. No support for education. The poor role models for status and roles, all of these things. If the family is not doing those well, the family itself may be failing, and therefore we can call it, from a sociological perspective, a dysfunctional family. Now, the symbolic interactionist perspective within sociology is what are our own values and beliefs and understandings about family. And for many people, family is very foundational. It's a very important part of their identity, and it essentially creates the foundation for the person they will be. And so my graphic represents that. I'm going to drop some bricks on you here. So here we have it, part of our core identity, part of our status for lifelong, being part of a family. It creates our kin, people who are like us and share our name, cousins and uncles and all that stuff. It has to do with our reputations, our family's reputation, our membership in that family, traditions, and of course the shared culture that we have in our families. These are essential aspects of our symbolic interactionist perspective on family. And finally, look at postmodern. What is consumerism and communication technology? And take a look at this graphic. Here we have a family. They're all on their phones. Anybody ever see this happen at their house? I see it all the time. And so sometimes we ask ourselves, what is the effect of technology on family? Are they communicating better, or are they communicating worse, or something? And the truth is, it's a mix of things. For families that are dispersed, they're so happy about technology because they can actually reach out and see each other. My children's mom lives in Arizona, and this Christmas she joined us for unwrapping there. She sent her presents to my house, and we put her up on an iPad, standing up, so it's like her face, and she watched them open their presents. Now, she was also on chemotherapy at that time, so there wasn't even this opportunity to kind of go down there for the kids and spend that time because COVID and her reduced immune system. But there's this great opportunity with technology to be able to share that time with my kids and their mom. So a really, really cool part of technology. Yet at the same time, we see people just with their noses in their phones all the time. Is there a point of balance where the technology can be used for really good purpose without dominating our time and interfering with the social relationships that we do have right in front of us? So the peculiar questions that we're asking now in this modern society. So speaking about questions, here's my assessments for this particular week. We have a discussion. This is the one that has two discussions. Our Chapter 14 discussion A is on family, and the discussion, Chapter 14 discussion B, is to comment on that technology aspect, good or bad. So that's the end. We have Chapters 13, Chapters 14, a bunch of assignments, and then next week we have a week off, so hooray. Get all these things done and have a nice and pleasant week off for spring break. So I will see you in the discussions, and I'm looking forward to your work.